Even the largest of vessels in the Aegis sail were small. Most of the precious space was taken up by cargo, cannons, provisions and material, with the sailors and passengers having to crowd in the cramped spaces that remained. Privacy was next to non-existent, and one can only imagine the lines to the bathroom after cookie served at plum duff. If you had your missus aboard shortly before leaving port, you couldn't be too shy about public intimacy, because your hammock would be tucked amidst dozens, and all your shipmates would also have a girl with them. At least they had blankets. No headphones though, it's gonna be a long night. Can you guys keep it down? I'm trying to sleep. Privacy was a luxury afforded to few. Important crewmen, such as artisans, officers, or even a wealthy passenger, might be afforded their own cabin. This was a small room created by light partitions, typically canvas or thin wood, that could easily be taken down in preparation for combat. They were still incredibly small. It could only fit a cot or hammock and a sea chest. Larger ships allowed for more cabins, and allotment often was always up to the captain's discretion. Of course, the biggest cabin was always afforded to him. A quick interlude before we go on. Gold Gunpowder is always struggling against the stream of the YouTube algorithm, and is dependent on viewer support for its continued survival. If you enjoy this content, liking the video and leaving a comment will ensure that the video spreads to more people. I also hear from my viewers that the videos do not show up in their feed. You have to click the subscribe button and notification bell to get pings about new releases. You can also join the Discord server where you get notified of new uploads, or simply check out the channel every Friday. I release videos on a weekly basis. The best way of supporting Gold Gunpowder is by becoming a channel member or Patreon supporter. For just $1 a month, you'll get ad-free access to weekly pirate content, mounting up to hours of monthly entertainment. Now, if you ask me, that's a pretty good deal. Let's get back to our regular program. Ships in the Aegis sail were a microcosm of society at large. They were built to awe and impress, with lots of gilded carvings and fanciful art, and remind the common folk of the power and wealth of the nobility and state. Shipboard society was a reflection of its land-based original. The rich and powerful governed the many and poor. Cabins were a symbol of royalty and status. It was the grand estate, the castle of the kingdom, and emblematic of the strict hierarchy deemed necessary to keep the ship afloat. After the restoration of the English monarchy, aristocratic volunteers flocked in droves to the navy and merchant marine, demanding the expansion of their shipboard conditions. In the Caribbean, French filibusters often looked down on their English contemporaries. The French scalawags had no qualms about cutting down the cabins to make their ships more combat efficient. Bigger ships allowed for bigger cabins. On the largest ships, they were grandiose affairs. On the fourth-rate Greenwich, built in 1666, the great cabin was the full breadth of the stern and 24 feet long, housing a study and elaborate paneling. These cabins had fantastic decorations, gilding and oil paintings. I had the pleasure to visit a similar one myself. Constructed in 1765, the HMS Victory, most famous for its partaking in the Battle of Trafalgar, and yes, I did mispronounce it so that you will comment about it. It's now housed at the Naval Museum in Portsmouth and open for visit, but they are doing some renovations, at least when I was visiting. That was because a modern ship rammed into it or something and broke a bunch of stuff. Ugh. Admiral Nelson, ancestor of local Springfield bully, was able to strut around on a vast tiled floor, drink from his own liquor cabinet, and dine with his officers at a long table. It was comparable to a small apartment. Things were a bit different on pirate ships. For one, pirate ships were much, much smaller than ships like the HMS Victory. She weighs in at 3,600 tons, whereas a pirate ship typically ranged between 10 to 200. The truly big ones were rare, and might sit at between 3 to 500. This in turn meant that the average pirate cabin was much smaller. One of the most common pirate vessels was the humble sloop. We have few plans or quote-unquote blueprints preserved of them from the period. A very detailed plan of a merchant sloop comes from 1745, the Mediator. Sitting at a total length of 61 feet, the cabin is about an eighth of that length, or 7 feet, 2 meters. The Mediator was quite broad at 20 feet, but sloops got more narrow towards the stern, so the cabin might only have had a breadth of 10 feet, 3 meters. That is a square meter of 6. The Mediator had a burthen of 104 tons, and though tonnage does not necessarily translate over to size, it does give an idea of how large a cabin could have been, depending on the size of the ship. Blackbeard's Queen Anne's Revenge had a displacement of 300 tons, 3 times that of the Mediator, so she might have had a cabin as large as 18 square meters. Space was limited, as were the number of items you would find inside a cabin. So, what would they keep there? We're going to start out with structural components, and then move on to the common furniture. But how did you access the cabin? That depends on how it was placed. On some vessels, it was placed in a structure raised over the main deck. That was the case on the Mediator. On larger vessels, this structure was typically longer, and would house a steerage before the cabin. This is where the helm was placed, and the ship steered from. Other cabins might be erected between the steerage and captain's cabin. On large vessels, the cabin was often topped by an additional structure called the roundhouse, used as a cabin for the navigator. The Great Cabin, the common period name for the captain's cabin, would then be accessed by a set of doors. They might be guarded, and during mornings, trumpeters would begin the day by blaring outside of them. And on pirates and privateers, the ship's articles were typically nailed to the cabin doors for any and all to peruse. On other vessels, typically small, the cabin would be placed below the main deck. It was accessible by a small hatchway on the quarterdeck, where you accessed the cabin by climbing down a ladder. The hatchway was often furnished into a raised housing, called a companion or companionway. The most important foundation of the cabin were the walls. It is what creates any kind of structure. Astern, starboard, and larboard, the cabin was surrounded by the back and sides of the ship, creating its primary walls. Forward, by a so-called bulkhead, an internal partition that could, in some cases, be removed before a battle in order to prevent splintering. Decorations of the walls varied. Some cabins had elaborate paneling and ornaments built into the walls themselves, and were further adorned with oil paintings. This painting shows us a great cabin furnished with these kinds of fanciful walls, painted with a pleasant blue, and filled in with paintings of ships. It is, however, a very large vessel, a kind never to be seen in the hands of pirates. The smaller cabins could still be painted in a pleasant color like green, perhaps blue, with a landscape or some other scenery on the forward bulkhead. It was very common to keep weaponry mounted on the walls of the cabin. We can see a musket and 2 pistols hanging on the wall in this image, along with navigational tools. Jacob de Bucquoy, a prisoner kept aboard the ship of Captain Taylor, described his life spent in a pirate's cabin. He mentions how Taylor, when sleeping, would always have his weapons hanging within reach, and would sometimes wake up from night terrors, thinking a mutiny was awry and grab for his armaments. Some of the cabin features were built into the structure itself. Most prominent were the windows, called lights. They were typically built chest high, as can be seen on this image again. On smaller vessels, the lights were typically much smaller, only being large enough to afford basic lighting during the day, and often placed so high up that it was difficult to get a view of the outside. The windows were usually boarded up before combat, to prevent shattered glass from spreading into the ship. Stern lights were usually flat, whereas starboard and larboard lights were usually built into galleries. This was an umbrella term applying to console structures built on the outside of a cabin, including fanciful turrets to house the lights, to balconies circumventing the entire aftercastle. If the ship had such a balcony, it would be accessed by a door in the great cabin. The problem with galleries was that they created unnecessary wind resistance, slowing the ship down. Pirates would typically remove them, and by the late 18th century, They had become a rare sight on ships. It is kind of fascinating that pirates would pioneer a lot of choices in ship design that would later become common usage. If the pirates decided to remove the galleries, they would convert the resulting hole into a gun port, stuffing the cabin with 1 or 2 cannons. It was relatively common, even on very large vessels, to have 1 or more great guns in the captain's cabin. In other cases, the hole created by the removal of the gallery could be turned into a hatch for entering or exiting the ship itself. An excellent escape route, if it came to that. The section of the stern holding the windows would often stick out from the rest of the stern, creating a ledge between the bottom of the windows and the deck of the cabin. This ledge or large windowsill could then be used as a seat, and this is usually where the captain's toilet was placed. In some cabins, this sort of sill or ledge could be created even if the windows did not stick out like this, creating not only a potential seat, but also a storage space. Sailors usually slept in hammocks, and though some great cabins might be furnished with them, it was more common to have a cradle. This was a proper, albeit quite small, bed, built into the ship itself. The sides of it were raised to prevent the sleeper from falling out in the case of a turbulent sea. One of the prime luxuries of the cabin was the bathroom. The captain could take his time and do so in private, either by a simple potty or a special seat built into the stern of the vessel. It was basically nothing but a hole leading down to the ocean itself. I'm certain that the sharks trailing the wake would enjoy anything dropped down through it. In order to move a ship in a certain direction, the rudder had to be shifted, thus redirecting the flow of water. The rudder was manipulated via a tiller, which on large vessels was usually connected to a second tiller, a whipstaff, and later on, the ship's wheel. On smaller vessels, the tiller usually went through the captain's cabin. In the case of an emergency, such as if the enemy laid down heavy fire on the whipstaff, the staff could be cut and the vessel steered from the safety of the cabin. It was more difficult to do so, since it was shorter and provided less leverage. That should cover all of the built-in features of a cabin. They could also have additional furniture which could be removed. Chairs and tables were the most ubiquitous. These could be used for large gatherings such as dinners, drinks, and gambling sessions, or even just for use as a work desk by the captain. Cabins would often have a special type of desk called a scrutory or escritoire. It is a small desk furnished with drawers in which were housed a number of items. The slave trader William Snelgrave mentioned 2 of these scrutories aboard his ship, both of which were smashed apart by pirates and all of the items plundered. Liquor was part and parcel of any seaman's life, no least the captain. He might enjoy for himself and his officers a more luxurious drink, kept in a special container. This was a decently sized chest, divided into compartments for keeping the bottles safe. The image you're seeing on screen should be from my visit to Nelson's cabin on the HMS Victory. Drinks were usually mixed up into punch and served in the punch bowl, and no captain's cabin was complete without this celebratory piece of ornament. They were richly decorated and often made from silver, and they gained an almost ritualistic status. A few of them were gifted to privateers by Queen Anne herself, whom Blackbeard named the ship after. They would often be found at shipboard ceremonies, and, according to legend, Captain Bartholomew Roberts always wanted his punch prepared by a chaplain, as if he desired it blessed. Other common items in the cabin were navigational tools and books. These books could be anything from practical to personal, the line between which could be thin. Books regarding navigation were definitely the most vital, as were guides on seamanship and various artisans' roles like gunnery. The journals of adventurers treaded a thin line between practical and personal, as they were read both for entertainment and to provide valuable knowledge of foreign lands to travelers and sea captains. Books, navigational tools, and anything else really was seldom kept in anything but sea chests, the most common type of furniture aboard a ship. They were built to be both sturdy, reliable, and flexible. their shape making them more stable on board of a ship, and usable as a container, table, and seat. Every sailor was typically allowed his own, provided there was space, and had to keep all of their belongings in them. A captain might be able to have multiple of them, each one holding a different item. Books, navigational tools, clothes, or whatever else he desired. Snelgrave mentioned having 2 large chests full of books in his cabin. The pirates threw them overboard, and it is possible he had more chests full of other items. The big question might be if the pirates kept their treasure chests in the cabin. Aboard the merchants and men of war, it was common practice to keep all of the money safe in the captain's cabin, and some pirates might have done so likewise. However, with their emphasis on egalitarian sentiment and fraternity instead of hierarchy, the treasure chest was often just kept in the hold, along with other forms of cargo. Individual captains might choose to decorate their cabins however they pleased, with whatever bits of plunder they had. When we see the captain's cabin in a pirate or period flick, it is usually lit up by live candles. It seems to have been relatively common to do so, but it was also a massive fire hazard. We know that it was common from the descriptions of accidents occurring from it, the ship catching fire and such. Therefore, pirates often had rules outlawing lit candles below deck, lest they be protected within a lantern. Though a captain might hope for privacy in his cabin, the lack of space aboard a ship would often oblige him to share it. The bunkmates were most often fellow officers who lacked their own private cabins, and would have hammocks or cradles raised for them. Some pirates would also give prisoners the luxury and protection of the cabin. The aforementioned Jacob de Bucquoy shared a cabin with Captain Taylor, albeit, and luckily, in separate beds. A captain might be more inclined to share his bed with a woman, and it wasn't unheard of for navy captains and merchantmen to bring their wives aboard. They would usually perform domestic duties, such as doing the captain's laundry. A few pirates did so as well. John Rackham famously had 2 women aboard, Anne Bonny and Mary Read, though their relationship to him are in all actuality uncertain, in spite of all the legends speaking of a bond between Rackham and Bonny, or even a triangle between the trio. Nor is it certain if Rackham's tiny sloop even had a cabin. Who knows what happened aboard that ship? Likewise, in opposition to legend, Bonny and Read were never disguised. But in 1687, a pirate named Captain Bear did bring a strumpet disguised as a man aboard his ship. He presented her as a noblewoman to the governor of Havana, who attended their wedding. Captains might also be attended in their cabins by the aptly named cabin boys, young lads designated as servants to the officers. The boys often had other duties aboard the ship, and with pirates, they typically served the entire crew, but traditionally they attended the captain's cabin. Sadly, the privacy offered by the captain's cabin offered the captain opportunities to abuse his boy servant, an incident not too uncommon in the period, and one pirate captain, Edmund Cook, was accused of buggering his servant. The captain's cabin is central to the pirate fantasy, a picturesque place of intrigue, oozing personality and adventure in the making. It is a shame that we have next to no written descriptions, let alone images, of what a pirate cabin might have looked like. Most of them probably looked ordinary enough, holding a variety of the aforementioned items. It is unlikely that they held more, and likelier that they held less. One description we have of a pirate cabin comes from a prisoner of Ned Lowe, George Roberts. All that Roberts really says is that Lowe sat upon a cannon in the cabin, although there were plenty of chairs in there. Roberts does not tell us this to describe the captain's cabin for us, but to emphasize Captain Lowe's martial personality. All that this really tells us is that there were a decent number of chairs in the cabin, and probably 2 or more cannons. If there were any other pieces of furniture, we do not know. It isn't unimaginable that Lowe's cabin only had cannons and a bunch of chairs, since pirates had a tendency of tearing down the cabin and throwing all the furniture overboard. The most vivid description we have of a pirate cabin comes from the aforementioned Snelgrave, as he described the nakedness of it, which was highly unusual for a great cabin in the period. It must be mentioned that period authors often just described things that were out of the ordinary, as everything normal was taken for granted. They didn't really care about how we would perceive these things from our period, in which, society and technology is vastly different. This means that we sometimes have a hard time understanding what was actually normal and what were edge cases, especially regarding pirates who are poorly documented in general. When Snelgrave was invited to parley in the cabin of Captain Coughlin, he found the room entirely barren. There was not in the cabin either chair or anything else to sit upon, for they always kept a clear ship ready for an engagement. So a carpet was spread on the deck, upon which we sat down cross-legged. Of course, Snelgrave mentioned previously how a bowl of punch was prepared for the occasion, because you cannot have a meeting aboard a pirate ship without a punch bowl. So that is how one pirate cabin looked like. A carpet, a punch bowl, and everyone seated on the floor. Snelgrave provided the reason. Cabins were knocked down and cleared their furniture before an engagement, and since pirates always expected a fight, they always wanted to keep a clear ship. However, some historians have given an alternate interpretation of the cabin's destruction. By tearing down all of the cabins, pirates removed all possibilities to scheme and intrigue. The pirates of the early 18th century were quite tyrannical and controlling. They often had press gang members forced into service, who might scheme and plan an escape. Other members might plan a mutiny or even to break up and retire from piracy prematurely, even though they had sworn to fight to the death. All of these voices, oppositional to the Black Flag, had to be squashed. Tearing down the cabin had a symbolic purpose. As I explained in the introduction, the cabin was the ultimate symbol of conventional shipboard hierarchy. By knocking it down, the captain and his officers were put on equal terms to the men. They had to share their conditions, eat with them, sleep with them, live with them. They became a part of the crew itself, rather than something separate. On pirate ships, the captain and officers were elected, and major decisions handled by a popular vote. Even though a captain might be afforded the luxury of his cabin, such as the case of Bartholomew Roberts, legend stated that any man aboard a ship could, if he so wished, go into the captain's cabin, take his plate and china, swear at him, and eat from his food and drink. In the case of Roberts' predecessor, Howell Davis, the company was allegedly ruled by a small minority, calling themselves lords. Unlike the common pirates, they were allowed entry in the Great Cabin. Therefore, the tearing down of the cabin and its anarchic symbolism was not a rule to all pirate ships. Becoming pirates does not necessarily mean that they abandoned the normative ideas of how shipboard and society at large was to be governed. A great many pirates were outspoken monarchists, and this might be reflective of their conventional views on hierarchy. Indeed, Coughlin might have been a relative exception. His successor, Captain Taylor, who we have mentioned before, employed a more strict hierarchy. He had his own cabin, where he treated his officers and prisoners. Here he had his own bed instead of just a hammock or naked floor, and they even enjoyed a different meal from the rest of the crew. And again, there were practical reasons for cutting down the cabin. Tearing down the cabin and tossing out all the furniture just made the ship lighter, speedier, and always ready for combat. Labatt mentioned how French filibusters always tended to cut away cabins, implying that a captain was forced to share the conditions of his men, even though French filibuster captains were often landholders and even aristocrats. So in the end, pirates and privateers might choose to keep or cut down the cabin for a variety of reasons: personal, practical, and ideological. Some might keep the cabin but still keep it open to public use. A lot of them probably did not look too different from what we imagine. They would just have been much smaller, had more limited furniture, and were probably more secure against fire. Lanterns instead of free candles, even though having a bunch of live candles in a pirate cabin does look really cool. Wait, what's that smell? Oh shit. With the cabin and its role in pirate society generally described, we can look at a couple of activities which usually occurred in the captain's cabin. Privacy was the key purpose of the cabin for any meeting, making it perfect for private discussions, and the cabin is usually where the pirate captains would entertain and talk things over with other captains they encountered, be they friends or foes. It was also the prime spot for the officers to gather, either for pleasure, to enjoy a dinner, a drink, but also to discuss their coming plans of motion and attack, without having to risk it leaking out. The cabin was sometimes managed in an almost ritualized fashion. If a visitor or prisoner was brought aboard a ship of Captain Lowe, they were first met by the gunner, compared to a master of the ceremonies. He would tell the visitor to pay his respects to the captain and lead him to the cabin. Here the captain would come out and greet the visitor, inviting him inside to have a seat. He would then ring the cabin bell, calling for a servant to prepare a bowl of punch. Potential recruits were often brought to the cabin in a similar manner. In order to join the crew, they would here have to sign the articles and swear an oath on some particular item. In one case, a Bible and a looking glass. If the recruit was forced to join against his will, he might be accompanied by 2 sentries, holding him at pistol's point. The cabin was also a highly defensible position. Unless someone would make the foolish attempt of climbing down the sides into the windows, they would have to press through the deck before it. The forward bulkhead could be fortified with additional planking and thick ropes, the doors barred, effectively turning the cabin into a bunker. The bulkhead might then be furnished with loopholes, allowing the defenders to fire through it. Additional weapons might be placed inside the cabin if the officers expected a mutiny, not only aboard the merchants and men of war. Captain Kidd, when facing a mutiny from his privateer crew, barred himself inside of his cabin together with a ship's boy, 40 muskets and 24 pistols between them. The mutinous men did not dare enter. Should this position grow unfeasible, the cabin was also a prime position to escape from. The lights or galleries could be opened, creating an easy hatch to climb out of. The ship's boat was usually towed behind the ship, and easy enough to access via these exits. It is famously depicted in Treasure Island, the officers barricading themselves in the cabin until they could escape in the ship's boat towed astern. A cabin window also served as the escape route for a couple of pirates. When Edward Lothar was finally cornered by the HMS Eagle, he escaped through the window of his cabin to a nearby island. When the Navymen tracked him ashore, they found him lying still, next to a discharged pistol. He would rather take his own life than strike a main, as it were. That is all I have to say about the pirate captain's cabin. There has been some interest in my consultation for creative projects, so if you wish to hire me for your novel or game design or whatever else, I have set up a Fiverr account where you can hire me. I offer research, proofreading, editing, critique, very harsh critique, but we can also just talk, spitball ideas, or whatever other suggestions you have. You'll find a Fiverr link in the video description or pinned comment below, or you can contact me via Discord or email. Otherwise, support Golden Gunpowder by liking, clicking the subscribe button and bell to get notified of new releases, and if you truly enjoy this content and have the resources, nothing helps more than $1 a month via channel membership or Patreon subscription. You'll also get early, ad-free access to weekly pirate content. Ooh, now that's a killer deal if I ever saw one.